Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Lauren Harrington, and it is my great pleasure to be the host of today's webinar. Joining me, we have Bob King, amateur astronomer extraordinaire and visual observer with some outstanding stories to tell. Bob has an exciting talk lined up for us today, but before we get started with that, I have just a couple of quick announcements to squeeze in. First, I'd like to point out a few features which we have here since Zoom is running in webinar mode today. If you take a look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a few different buttons. There's the chat box, like you're probably used to from other Zoom meetings. Then there's also a show captions button, which you can use to enable or disable Zoom's automatic closed captioning. And finally, you should have a Q&A button. When you click on the Q&A button, you will have the option to submit questions for our presenter today. You can submit as many questions as you would like at any point during the presentation. Don't worry, it's not going to interrupt the presentation when you submit questions. After the presentation, we have some time set aside for a Q&A, and we will try to answer as many of your questions as we can. Okay. I would also like to take a moment to mention our 2025 annual campaign. We've already received over $36,000 in donations just since the annual campaign launched less than a month ago. To each and every one of you who has contributed, I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your support. It's really your support and your contributions that allow us to keep going and keep making an impact on variable star science. To those of you who are a little bit on the fence, been considering donating, but maybe not sure yet, there's no better time than today. We are an efficient organization, and your dollar will have an outsized impact in furthering variable star science, education, and observation. Thank you for your consideration. I'd also like to mention about next year's webinar series. We have an exciting schedule lined up, still putting the final polish on it. When it's ready, it'll be published on aavso.org/webinars. So be keeping an eye on that webpage. We'll also be sending out an email with the schedule when it's ready. Our first webinar of the year is scheduled for January 11th. And for this one, we're going to be doing something a little bit completely brand new. I don't want to give too much away, but this is going to be a much more interactive session than usual, even in comparison to our how-to webinars. So mark your calendars and keep an eye out for an announcement around the new year with the registration link inside. And yeah, probably shouldn't say more than that at this moment. Okay. Now I would like to thank our 2024 series sponsor, Boyce Astro. The Boyce Research Initiative and Education Foundation provides online astronomy education, observatory resources, and research experiences to students, student teams, and schools in order to learn how to perform observations, conduct research, and publish their results in scientific journals, such as the Journal of the AAVSO. Please check out their webpage to learn more about their work. Okay, now the moment you've all been waiting for. Our speaker today, Bob King, is an author and educator. He fell in love with the night sky and astronomy when he was a kid, and he loves to share his passion with people of all ages through teaching and public observing. He is a community educator and writes for Sky and Telescopes magazine and website. He also just completed a book titled Magnificent Aurora, a comprehensive guide detailing the aurora borealis and how anyone can contribute to auroral science. You might know of him from his longtime blog, Astro Bob, which he started back in 2008. Or you might know of him because he has been an AAVSO member since 1982. He has deep roots in our community, and we're very excited to welcome him to our virtual stage today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bob King. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And it really is a great honor to be here. I was surprised. I was like, wow, that is wonderful. So I'm happy to share some of my own experiences as a variable star observer. I am a visual observer, although I'll touch just briefly on a tiny bit of photographic observing that I'm also in the process of doing right now. I'm here in Duluth, Minnesota, where it looks like we might have a clear night. So I'm hoping to catch a view of T Corona Borealis this evening before it sets. So crossing my fingers. With that, we'll go to the presentation. And that should be there just a second. And I hope at this point that you can see
You can see your screen.
you can see the screen. There it is.
Yep.
It took
Looks
longer to come up for me, pardon me. So I just call it things I never thought I'd see really, and how variable stars, how being an AAVSO member over the years has really opened my eyes to kind of the living universe, the fact that the universe is a very active, evolving place, and that we're privileged as variable star observers to see things occurring right before our eyes that are key processes in basically the creation and the all the different processes in the universe that ultimately lead to life. Like a lot of you, when I was younger, because I got interested in astronomy when I was about 11 years old, I knew two variable stars. I was aware of Algol in the constellation Perseus, which is an eclipsing variable. You could see it flash on and off over a period of just under 3 days. And Algol, of course, involves a larger, fainter, less massive star revolving around a smaller, brighter, more massive star. And when it's mostly eclipsed, partially eclipsed, the whole system's magnitude drops, and so it fades, and then it pops back out and it recovers. I also knew of that other very famous variable star, Mira, in the constellation of Cetus, but I only knew about it as a star I would look at in the sky and go, oh, Mira's visible. That's cool. Or Mira's gone. Because Mira is a very different type of star. It involves a pulsation, actual physical change in the star's appearance. It shrinks, contracts, heats up, then expands outward again, kind of overshoots the limit, cools, and then contracts. So one of the things you're going to be seeing in this presentation are a number of astronomical illustrations and animations. And to me, these are key to us understanding and appreciating what we see when we look through our telescopes at these objects. Because as everyone knows, when you look, just about everything is a tiny blip, a mere point of light. But these illustrations, which are based on models, based on science, really help us to kind of picture and spark our imaginations to see what's actually happening. And there's a beautiful feedback loop here in that as we contribute our observations and astronomers pick those up, go through them and incorporate them into their models, we're actually helping to improve our understanding and these astronomical illustrations. So further enhancing the reality of the experience. I was not particularly interested in variable stars. Like I said, I only knew those two until I read the book Starlight Nights by Leslie Peltier, the Ohio amateur astronomer. I, I hope a lot of you have read this book. If you haven't, try to get a copy somehow because the prose is just so beautiful. And he really inspired me to look at variable stars right around the time that I bought a rather expensive telescope. Back in the early 80s, I purchased a C11, a Celestron C11, and this is the only photograph I could find of me using it, sort of this shadowy character off in the left hand of your screen. And it costs a lot of money, and I said to myself, if I'm going to spend that much money on a telescope, why not use it for some scientific enterprise too? Because primarily I've been doing deep sky objects and comets and planets and so on. Nothing wrong with that. But I thought if I had this magnificent instrument, I should maybe pick up another hobby, another aspect of it to contribute something to the overall picture. And that happened about the time I read Leslie's book, and he just charmed me with variable stars. And so I contacted the AAVSO, and back in those days, of course, they would send you star charts through the mail. And I was just as excited as Peltier was when that brown envelope would arrive in the mail. Of course, nowadays it's all fully available, totally democratized. Anybody can download a chart from the aavso.org website. Now, I was very excited to get out and find my first variable, and I recall it as being V Cassiopeia, VCAS. And I got out there, I had my chart, I had my red flashlight, and I'm trying to get to the star. and I couldn't get there at all. It was impossible. I never knew how difficult it was to track down a star. I had no problem with deep sky objects, but trying to find my way through this wilderness of stars, well, I persisted like the rest of you did, and eventually got better and better and better at it to the point where I could pick up a chart like this for EM Cygni and quickly work my way towards the star. Of course, we do this as variable star observers by creating all these interesting figures like candy canes and pentagons and triangles and lines and whatever. And we memorize these little patterns in the sky and they help us get to the object. Little did I know, the more variables I observed, the more well-versed I was in finding virtually anything in the sky. And this is not to brag, but at this point, you give me a chart and I could find anything in the sky, pretty much, thanks to all I've learned in trying to track down these faint stars through these great wildernesses of stars, these variables, up there in the sky. Well, I looked at Mirus. Of course, I still do. And I've looked at eclipsing binaries and symbiotic stars and the whole lot of them, a great variety. But I have to be honest and tell you that the ones that excited me most, and maybe it's just my personality, were the dwarf novae or the cataclysmic variables. The thought that I could see something appear out of nothing. One night, no star visible. The next night, oh my gosh, here's a bright star right in front of my eyes, and experience the excitement of seeing this sort of explosive event really attracted me to these cataclysmics, including, and first and foremost, SS Cygni, which I'm sure a lot of you have observed. Here it is in its quiet state. And there it is during an outburst, a difference of roughly 4 magnitudes. So it's super obvious, easy to check in a nice bright field in the constellation of Cygnus. Relatively nearby star, 370 light years distant. And when I look at SS Cygni, I'm sort of picturing in my mind what's actually happening, where we have a red dwarf star, as you see on the right, and it's in a very tight orbit with a dense, tiny, Earth-sized white dwarf. And that dwarf is pulling material from the dwarf, the red one, into an accretion disk. And it's instabilities within that disk, within the flow of the disk, that creates these bright hot spots on occasion. And those are the things that we actually observe. So when we look at that point of light, or at least when I do, I try to picture this scenario happening right in front of me. So again, thanks to astronomical illustrations based upon works by astronomers and ultimately, in part, our own observations, we can perceive in our mind's eye what's actually happening. And this brings me great joy and great excitement when I look at variables. Here it is. We have an outburst from SS Cygni about every 50 days. You can see it blinking on and off there, just like a little Christmas light. I looked at it the other night. It was about 11.6. So it was just a little bit above its normal minimum. One of the coolest things about using variable star charts is that they include many fainter stars and stars you might think you can't observe, but they're there to tempt you. And one of my favorite charts is for the UGEM cataclysmic VY Aquarii. And in there's a 16.2 magnitude star. And over the years, I have tried to see it, and I have succeeded multiple times and realized that no matter what the telescope magnitude calculators might say, I can get down to 16.2 magnitude. That's here in Duluth with some light pollution. So it expanded my range, expanded possibilities for me in variable stars. And as you know, a lot of the cataclysmics are very faint at minimum. So now I realize I could observe lots more of these dwarf novae and see them all through their entire cycle. Some of my favorites are IP Pegasi, UGEM Minorum, of course, and TZ Persei. Each one has its own sort of period, location, and personality. And I've gotten to know these and many more over the decades that I have been an AAVSOer. Related to these types of stars are novae, and they also involve a pair of stars. So you've got a red giant or perhaps a red dwarf, and you've got a white dwarf that is pulling material from that star. Except in this case, in a nova's case, it actually piles up on the surface of the white dwarf, becomes heated to a thermonuclear explosion, and then erupts and creates the nova outburst. My favorite nova is Nova Delphini 2013 V339 Del. Discovered August 2013, peaked at just a little fainter than Mag 4. I think this is probably the brightest nova that I've seen in recent years. It's very easy to find, a joy to watch. And I wanted to share this illustration with you of what happens in a nova situation, whether that be a recurrent nova or a nova. And so I'll activate it here just so you can see. This is from the NASA Visualization Studio, where there's some just beautiful illustrations of these things. There you have the white dwarf surrounded by the accretion disk, red giant star. They are orbiting very close to each other. The dwarf is pulling material into the disk, and then the fun happens as that material funnels down onto the surface of the dwarf. It compacts until it heats to such a high temperature that it ignites, basically, and it creates this enormous explosion. And that's what we really see when we look at a nova, that expanding fireball of material from the explosion. So to continue with V339 Del, here's a light curve from the AAVSO. And one of the things I learned soon about observing novae was that they change color. At first, they're sort of colorless, sort of bluish white maybe, and then they sort of become an orange and then red. And I wonder what is going on, and came to learn that that red is from hydrogen emission. There's a lot of hydrogen gas. That's what's pulled off in the first place from the companion. And as it's heated in the fireball and gradually cools, it emits all kinds of light, in particular, hydrogen alpha, red light. So I am watching here the expanding fireball, and it first turns red. And then you'd think it was done. After a time, the star fades to a point where it's just a very faint object. It doesn't really show any color anymore because it doesn't excite the cones in your eyes. But I learned by continuous observation that at a certain point, several months after the eruption, this cloud of gas has expanded to the point where it's so rarefied that it's now emitting in other wavelengths too, like a planetary nebula, doubly ionized oxygen. And so from red, it goes to oxygen and other element emissions that you can see if you use a nebular filter. So this is an O3 filter. So I would take my O3 filter and I would pass it between my eye and the eyepiece looking at V339, and it would be bright with the filter and then look faint without it. So I was actually seeing this rarefied cloud, the emissions from it, with my own eye right here in my driveway in Duluth. So this is a very exciting thing. It's a connection to me. Anytime we make a connection with nature, whether that be through something in the sky, or it might be a seasonal connection with the snow or a particular flower or animal, that bond, that connection with nature and that moment of understanding is just so life fulfilling for me. It just makes me happy. Well, I looked at a lot of novae, and some of you are familiar probably with David Bishop's page. Out east, he has a page called The Latest Supernova. I'll give the link later. And in it, he also includes, besides supernovae explosions in galaxies, novae in nearby galaxy. So in October of 2009, I was carefully watching to see if there would someday be a nova bright enough that I could see it in another galaxy. And it happened. On October 11th, there was one discovered in Andromeda, and that's called 2009-10b. You can see there. Started out at 17.6. It rose all the way to 14.6. When I could see that it was rising, and it was sufficiently far from the nucleus to be, I guess, relatively easy to find. I made a chart. I used Megastar for most of my charting. And I created this chart. This is from my journal that I keep of observations. And I pasted it in. I took the nova chart, I went out there, and star by star by star by star, I eventually landed on the nova. And I just sat there and stared at that point of light for I don't know how long, but just the pleasure of seeing a process happen in an object 2.5 million light years distant that we see here in our own Milky Way. This sort of, it dawns on you of the universality of processes, physics and processes in the universe. Yes, you can read it on paper, but when you actually see it in the night sky, whoo, it's kind of a thrill. So I think I used a couple explanation points in that pencil writing that I had there. And that brings me to T Corona Borealis, which I mentioned at the outset. Here it is. Of course, we're all waiting. I've looked at it as many nights as I can. I'm hoping I'll be the first guy to see it. Probably not, but it's really exciting that it's from my latitude, it's visible early in the evening and then in the morning. So it's 365 days a year. So I hope to get out soon to see it. It's currently at magnitude 10.1 visually. And I do some teaching. I do community ed teaching in astronomy, and I write that blog. And in it, I encourage people. First of all, I show them how to find this constellation. Then I say, when you're out and it's clear and that constellation is out, just take a picture with your smartphone. You never know. You might capture it right at, your limit, which I tested with my smartphone, and I can get down to about magnitude 6. So who knows? It could become a critical point in a light curve when this star eventually does, as a recurrent nova, does have its outburst that we're all so anticipating. We're going to move on to bigger things now, bigger blasts, bigger explosions. Yes, when I was a kid, I liked firecrackers, and who knows, maybe that's why I like tracking down cataclysmic variables and the bigger blasts, the supernovae. So here we have a star in hydrostatic equilibrium. The energy that is being output from the nuclear reactions within the star's core, the fusion of hydrogen into helium, helium into other elements, is pushing back against the overlying weight of the star, which keeps that star nice and stable, at least for now. But if you're a supergiant star, you have a different lifeline, a timeline. And supergiant stars, as we know, eventually run out of burnable fuel, nuclear material within their core that can fuse to create the necessary energy to hold back the outer layers. And when that fuel is done, the core collapses and there's a tremendous rebound and it tears the star apart. And we're going to see it blow up here right in front of your eyes. We have a red supergiant, perhaps a star like Betelgeuse and Orion. And then there's this enormous release of energy far beyond the scope of what a nova can produce. Enough energy release that supernova explosions are visible across the cosmos, across billions of light years. There are a couple of different types. We're going to look at a type 2 supernova, which is what you saw prior, a supermassive star collapsing and exploding. And here we have a fairly recent one, 2023 IXF, that was visible in the galaxy M101, the pinwheel. You can see it right here. It's a type 2, and it really hung around for a long time. It's a great joy to observe. Generally, it's not impossible. There are stars that we can see in nearby galaxies with amateur telescopes, but for most of us, our best opportunity is to wait for one to blow up. And then it becomes so fantastically bright that even a 6-inch telescope can pick up a supernova. And this one was certainly bright enough to see in my 15-inch reflector. I use a 15-inch and a 10-inch telescope primarily, both Dobsonians. There are also type 1A supernovas, and how wonderful that M101 provided us with examples of both. There was the very famous and very bright supernova back in 2011 FE, a type 1A, also out here in the galaxy's spiral arms. And here, in the case of type 1A supernovae, you have a binary. Here we are, another binary situation. But instead of a accretion disk flare or a nova situation, enough material accumulates on the star that it begins sort of an explosive nuclear burning that completely burns through and destroys the star and creates that enormous blast. Here's some sketches I've made of various supernovae over the years. I've lost count. I used to keep a list every year. I've lost count of how many I've seen, but well over 200 of them. They're so enjoyable. Every time one happens, I gotta be out there because not only is the fact that you're seeing something so distant that also has happened in our Milky Way and will again, but you're actually seeing, to me, sort of the origin of life. A lot of this material goes out into space and becomes part of the interstellar medium, the dust and such, the ice, the iron, and it's gradually reincorporated into new stars and planetary systems. And these new stars have more complex elements in them after a supernova explosion. And of course, the complex elements on planets can ultimately lead to the possibility for life. So faint stars are not easy to see in a telescope. You're always contending with tough seeing conditions. At least here, it's just pretty terrible in Duluth. So I'm looking frequently, to try to catch a night of good seeing when things settle down and stars are more clearly visible. So given that the seeing isn't great on many nights, these are just some of the techniques I use in order to see some of these very faint objects, whether that be just a naked variable or something within a galaxy like a supernova. Of course, averted vision always works. I have used averted vision. I think I can do about a half an hour, maybe 35 minutes of averted vision before I become cross-eyed. Or I've got a secret reserve eye. So my right eye is my primary, and that's the one I'm generally averting in order to see these faint objects, especially when they're buried in galactic haze. And so I'm flicking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. If that eye doesn't work, I will take the left eye and use it it's like a fresh eye in reserve, and I will use it. It's not good for planetary detail, but it does have averted vision abilities. I'll look away from the object. That's another easy thing to do is after you've concentrated so long and trying to see something, it's important to just turn around, look away, take a broad view in of the sky. I'll look at the stars, the Milky Way, return to the eyepiece, and then try it again. And sometimes that refreshing of your eye really helps. I'll double check maps, and make sure I'm exactly at the right location. There's the tapping motion on the telescope where you just tap that tube or you sweep back and forth, you wiggle it a little bit. And this activates, it's very good for our rod receptors in the eye, which are excellent at detecting motion. So when you do this, that little bit of motion sometimes reveals, however briefly, that variable star or the supernova. Refocusing, always refocus, in and out, in and out. Never trust your first focus. It's a good start, but go back and forth because focus can actually change during the night depending on what's happening with the air, the atmosphere. Changing magnification, go all the way up. If I barely see it, I'll go up as far as I can. And for me, that's around 400, 450x. And if it's too blurry, drop back down, but work it up and down to find the optimum magnification. Then my yoga-like breathing exercises. I'll take in a lot of deep, well, not a lot, but a few deep breaths, and then use, at least mentally in my mind, I'm getting more oxygen, which is helping me out in my observation. Maybe I'm just telling myself that. And then finally, what I call is mental stacking. Repeatedly observing the location of the object repeatedly over time, and sort of your brain is picking up an image, but it needs multiple tries in order for you to lock in. And I will not report an observation of a faint object unless I actually see it quite a few times. Even if they're short glimpses, I have to be able to see it. I've learned at the very outset that in my observations, I have to be honest about whether it's there or not. It doesn't do me or anybody else any good to think it might be there. So if it's unsure, I'll always leave a little note and say uncertain, needs to be reobserved. Lately, I've tried something else new, which is super helpful if you want to try to track down a supernova that you may have heard about, but there are no photographs of it yet. I bought one of these sea stars, and I thought, well, how faint can this thing reach? And I discovered that it can get down to the faintest supernova that I photographed with this 50 millimeter instrument is 16.3. It's barely visible. And I got that in about a 25 minute stacking exposure. But this one was only 10 minutes. This is 2024 JLF, a supernova that was visible in Virgo earlier this year, the galaxy NGC 5690. Quality's not fantastic, but man, it is such a great check on whether you can actually see the supernova. And if you don't have a photo, you can do it yourself. So it's been a great, great addition to my variable star observing. So as long as we're talking about supernovae, we talked about the type 2 collapse, then there's the type 1, the binary. The Crab Nebula is certainly the most famous supernova occurred in our galaxy. First observation by the Chinese on July 4th, 1054 AD. It's a type 2. There you see the crab. I made the pilgrimage. This is not my photo, but I made the pilgrimage to Chaco Culture National Historical Park. I call it a pilgrimage because once you arrive, you take this sort of long walk through the hills and the mesas, and then you arrive at this place where you look up underneath the shelf of rock, and there's this very famous pictograph showing what appears to be crescent moon, the hand, and a stellar object, perhaps. And some people think there's no absolute proof that this is a depiction of the supernova in July of 1054. At that time, the Anasazi people would have inhabited the canyon. And when I stood there underneath this pictograph and I turned around, it faced to the east. There was a very broad eastern view. So yes, it's possible that that may be connected, or maybe it isn't. But for me at the time, I kind of got this deep vibe that it was possible. So I went back home and I looked at what the sky looked like back in July of 1054. And on the 5th of that month, the moon was very close to the supernova, the crescent moon, which resembles this sketch, this painting that was done. Again, we don't know, but I would like to believe that it was recording perhaps what the sky looked like on the morning of July 5th, 1054. Of course, we know that now as amateurs, when we look up, we see the remnant of the supernova, which is the expanding cloud of gas and debris. We also see the core of it lit up by radiation spawned by what's left after the explosion. In this case, the whole star wasn't fully obliterated. There was a pulsar, a spinning neutron star just 12 miles, 20 kilometers across, spinning at 33 times a second. And what you see here with the Hubble Space Telescope imagery is the pulsar wind rippling through the interior gases of the nebula. And they've converted the spin to sound, so we can actually listen to what a pulsar. You'll be hearing that now. Kind of like somebody working on one of the molars in your teeth, doing an extraction. But anyway, it is fascinating. Well, I tried in my 15-inch to see this pulsar, to see the remnant neutron star, something just 12 miles across, but I couldn't. It was beyond my scope. But one night, back in September 5th, 2021, I was at the Minnesota Astronomical Society Northern Nights Starfest. And they had there on the site a 30-inch Dobsonian. And there was a fellow who was piloting the Dobsonian, and it was very late at night because this was like August or early September. And Taurus had risen pretty high in the east. And I asked him, I said, Brandon, what do you think we point that at? Can I point that at M1, the Crab Nebula? I'm going to see if I could track down the pulsar. Never seen it. I know it's about magnitude 16.5. So I called up a photo of the crab on my smartphone, and I stood up there on that tall ladder at the eyepiece and gradually star hopped my way to the center, pretty much the center of the Crab Nebula. And I found the 16.1 magnitude star pretty much right in the center. You'll see picture those two stars there. I'm like, oh my gosh, I could see that star. Can I get to the pulsar? And with a lot of time and averted vision, first I saw it as elongated. And then during the moments of best seeing, I was able, at a magnification of 560, I was able to separate the two and clearly see the pulsar. Wow, was I happy. I was just so delighted I mean, imagine you're seeing like a star that's just 12 miles, 20 kilometers in diameter at a great distance from the Earth. And the fact that that is what's left from the star that created the bright blast that was seen by the Chinese and our distant ancestors, and perhaps and undoubtedly the Anasazi in Chaco Canyon, whether or not they made a pictograph of it. And I suddenly felt connected historically to all these kind of times and cultures. And it was one of those great experiences as an amateur astronomers, where we feel the vastness of things, but we also feel like we fit right into it. That's what I was looking at. I wish I could blink fast enough to actually see it blink. That can be done with a small device at the telescope. But yes, we're looking at a spinning neutron star, beaming radiation in Earth's direction, blinking away happily at the center of the crab. And that brings me to Betelgeuse. All right, Betelgeuse, another potential supernova candidate in Orion. Here it is in a wider shot. This was taken from my front yard back last month on the 27th of November. You're all familiar with what happened to Betelgeuse, how things got really revved up and exciting when this star faded back in late 2019. And it was all over the internet and media, and people were observing it. And I was encouraging people to send in magnitude estimates of it and so on. And it dropped way down there, as you can see on the left. And then it gradually recovered over time. And there was talk, of course, oh, this is it. Betelgeuse is going to expire. We're going to have a supernova. Well, it wasn't anything quite like that. It was a bit more mundane, but just as fascinating, because what had happened, to our best knowledge, is that an enormous bubble of material, a convection cell within the supergiant star, bubbled up to the surface and released quite a bit of material into space, which gradually condensed as a sort of soot. And that darkened soot-like cloud helped block or eclipse part of Betelgeuse, causing it to dim. And again, thanks to these illustrations and the work done by astrophysicists, we can picture what we saw, which is wonderful. This is what we really want to see happen, though, of course. And whether it's going to happen tonight or in 1,000 years, who knows? But some night, sometime, somebody's going to wake up, we hope, and see this tremendously bright version of Betelgeuse when it does ultimately become a supernova. Well, we looked at neutron stars and novae. Another way for a supergiant star to end its life, besides leaving a remnant and a neutron star, is to just go all the way and form a black hole. And sometimes these black holes are paired up with other stars in binary systems. And I wondered whether it was possible for me to see, certainly not see a black hole, but see the effects of a black hole on its environment. And so I learned through the AVSO that V4641 Sagittarii was a great example of an X-ray binary. And there it is. You could see it in the blizzard of stars down here, the little open circle. Oh, how we love those little open circles right there in the midst of it all. For me, Sagittarius is not very high, so it takes some digging. Seeing isn't so good. The stars normally kind of faint around magnitude 14. But what's fascinating is that material from that star on the right, the B star, is being pulled into an accretion disk around a black hole that has a mass of about 6 times that of the sun. And occasionally, instabilities there, and not instability so much as material actually falling down the black hole, heating up and radiating across the entire spectrum. We can see these flares from material basically going down the drain, heated up and burning. And by gosh, after quite a bit of time of observing it, it happened August 5th, 2003. Oh, it was at a magnitude 11.8. And only a variable star observer would point their telescope at something that would be 14th magnitude, see it at 12th and go, holy heck, this is the best thing I've seen all night. And so this was my first, and I think my only at this point, sighting of something related directly to a black hole where I've seen an outburst connected to a black hole. Then we like to supersize. Okay, you have those solar mass or larger black holes, but then as we know well, many galaxies possess supermassive black holes. Our Milky Way has one of 4 million solar masses, and the one that's in M87 in Virgo, that giant elliptical galaxy, that's like 6 billion solar masses. And they've got their disks around them, and they're gobbling up stuff that happens to come too close. And when that happens, there's a bright eruption, and we see that as a quasar. Quasars are visible all across the sky in galaxies at enormous distances. And when the quasar is pointed rather, instead of from the side, but more directly towards us, that material that beams out of either pole is headed in our direction, pointed at us. That's called a blazar, but they're essentially the same thing, quasar, blazar. And a supermassive black hole, a distant galaxy, where material is being munched on, devoured by a very large black hole, and erupted. And one of the coolest ones I've ever seen, and this is fairly recent, there was a blazar, and this one's AU Canis venaticorum, otherwise known as, you see the other name here, B2 1308 plus 326. It's in Canis Venatici, just below the handle of the Big Dipper. And this past, in July, I should say 2 years ago, in July of 2022, I got word through the astronomers' telegrams of an outburst here, that it was historically bright. And when I see the words historically bright, I think, I've got to get out with my telescope right away. And so I did, and I was able to catch it near the peak of its outburst, 13th magnitude. I mean, you're seeing something again that's incredibly far away in a distant galaxy. And then it dropped and dropped. And obviously there's variability in these things all the time, depending upon what's falling in, how it's shredded up and heated, et cetera, et cetera. But I watched this dim over time from magnitude 13.5 when I caught it, all the way down into the 14s. So this was a very exciting and very fulfilling experience for me. And more recently, I made my personal distance record as far as who doesn't want to, what is the farthest thing you can see? Those who are educators will talk to their students and say the farthest star is such and such. And the most distant thing you can see in the nighttime sky typically is the Andromeda Galaxy, 2.5 million light years away. Well, over the decades, I've been trying to expand my universe, pardon the pun, by seeing how far a quasar or blazar I might be able to view in my telescope. And this fall, I picked up on PG 1634 plus 706. It's in the constellation of Draco. And it wasn't even that faint. Right now, or at that time when I observed in an early November, it was magnitude 14.5. This object has a redshift of 1.337 The light left it 11.5 billion years ago. And when you add in the expansion of the universe, 21 billion light years. So this was incredibly remote. And again, that's what I love about being a variable star observer, is that I am a traveler. I mean, not only in distance are we travelers, but we travel through time when we make our observations. And we make these connections. We have our families, we have our neighborhoods, but our world includes the entire cosmos, which is what is so life affirming for me. And we see the processes, the production of dust, say, in a supernova, or in the evolution of a planetary nebula that ultimately leads to the formation of new stars and new planets and life. These are some of the resources that I use, because you might wonder, well, how are you finding out what quasar to look at? How do you know there's an outburst? You may have your own sources, no doubt, but these are what I use. Of course, the AAVSO, wonderful website, great for making charts. The TIMAC timing database at Krakow. If you enjoy eclipsing binaries, and you like ones where you can actually see it happen right in front of your eyes, literally in real time in the matter of an hour or two, go to this place, the timing database at Krakow. Stefan Karga's Frankfurt, pardon the misspelling there, Frankfurt, should say with a K, quasar monitoring. Wonderful list of quasars and blazars with lots of information about them, their magnitude ranges, charts, photographs. This has been one of my key resources. The other, when it comes to supernovae, is David Bishop's page that I mentioned earlier, where there's an up-to-date listing of newly discovered objects. You can also subscribe to the Astronomer's Telegram, and you get rapid notification of quasars, blazars, radio galaxies, all kinds of things that are way beyond your range, at least my range, but still there's a number of great things in there within, an amateur's range of observation. The transient name server, also reporting regular emails of interesting transients. And then, of course, there's the minima of Algol, kind of where it started for a lot of us, with something you just look at with your naked eye. And I should also mention that there are notifications that you can sign up for at the AAVSO to be notified of bright nova, supernovae. So lots of opportunities. You want to screen grab this or just take a picture with your smartphone, go right ahead. And my last slide is really, it shows to me, you're out there, you're like this person, you're out there standing on the shoreline. I've always loved this quote from Carl Sagan, because we're literally on the shoreline of this enormous cosmic ocean, and we are trying to reach out and understand what's happening. And we do this through observation, through imagination, through bringing information to all these blips of light that we see through our telescopes. And it really is our love of and desire to interpret and understand the universe is really, we're just like the voice or the brain of the cosmos. We're trying to know this universe, and this is the best way we know how. So going out at night is witnessing these grand processes that define our universe and that enrich and literally enlarge our lives. And with that, I'll finish up here. And if you do have any questions, feel free.
Bravo, bravo. Thank you, Bob. That was an excellent talk. Oh my gosh.
Oh, thank you.
It has been a long time since I've heard a person say the sort of things that make me as excited about visual observing as actually going out and observe does. Very, very.
It really is. I mean, all the cold and all the mosquitoes and all the rest of it, is always
Yeah.
my star charts have crushed mosquitoes on them. So
Yep. Okay, so we have had a couple of questions come in already.
oh, good.
So our first here is so when you were talking about changing the magnification in order to improve your limiting magnitude, do you use a zoom eyepiece, or do you just swap out fixed focus eyepieces, starting at high power and dropping until it's no longer blurry?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't use zoom eyepieces. I use just individual focal lengths, and I tend to start at low magnification because I like to see, can I see this with just low magnification? And if I can't, then I go to the level I need to get to. I normally start at about 64x, and then I'll go up to about 250, 220 in that area, especially for anything that's fainter than, we'll say, magnitude 14, 14.5. And I might need to go higher, in order to separate, like if a supernova is near another foreground star, you've got to separate those two in order to confirm. So I kind of scale it up and down until I hit the sweet spot. And by the way, there are nights you just have to give up. And I didn't mention that, where you hit your height, you can't separate. You just have to walk away, and then try again another night, hopefully when the seeing is better.
Mhm. Good advice. And piggybacking on that question a little bit, I noticed that in several of your observations, you mentioned using very high magnification, like when you were going after the crab pulsar 500x something. Um, I've commonly heard the advice told to new observers, never go above 250x, you won't get anything out of it. Has that been your experience, or have you observed something different?
No, no, we all know that after 250, everything kind of looks bad. You know? But you know what? It's still there, and you're darkening the sky background even when you go above 250, and so it can still give you a bit of an edge until it begins to blur too much. And one of the greatest things I learned from at a public observing session is I was showing people Saturn one night. And this one, I was showing it, at 150. And this one fellow said, "Well, can you go higher?" I said, "Yeah, I can go higher." "How high?" So I can go to about 1,000. So can we go there? And I said, "Well, I can bring us up to about 700 or whatever it was." And I put it in, and he looked at it and says, "Wow, that's really great," even though it was a blurry mess. And so that guy taught me to go for it anyway. So there is no limit on magnification. Just see what works best.
Got it. Okay, good advice. Thank you. Um, one more question in the vein of eyepieces and magnification and all that. David Alamo is curious whether you prefer low glass count eyepieces, such as orthoscopics, or high count, such as the Televue, Ethos, and Delos, and those kind of eyepieces.
I tend to go with the fairly high count. I grew up with orthoscopics and Kellners and all of those, and they're very narrow fields of view. And as eyepieces completely changed in the 80s, 90s up till now, I love the comfort factor and the eye relief are very important to an observer because relaxation of the eye is critical in seeing faint things. And that's part of the reason I breathe too. I may take several breaths, let go of the air, it relaxes me. And then having that eye relief makes a big difference. So yes, I do use multiple element eyepieces, quite a few. I don't have many of the really expensive ones, but I've got the whatever, the wide field, Erfel type style, 6 element, whatever. And very happy with those. So, but if you think that you're going to gain a little edge on light by using an orthoscopic with a 4 elements or 3 whatever, go for it. And I know how light photons are so precious when it comes to finding these faint objects.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Our next question here comes from Timothy Weaver, who asks, where did you learn how to sketch? I've tried sketching what I see through my scope, but I think my sketches look horrible. So any tips?
Oh, that's such a nice question. Thank you for asking that. Um, I am a really horrific artist. I can't draw a human face to save my life, but with what I do is I just use pencil lead and an eraser, and then you can get a lot of mileage out of the side of your pinky. That's what I use for smearing for nebulosity.
Mhm.
And so I'll just roughly sketch in, say, the spiral arms of a galaxy very gently with pencil lead. It truly is primitive, and I should up my game. But then I take my finger and I smooth and I dab, and you know, just to create an eyepiece impression and then
Mhm.
position the supernova or the object, whatever it is. So I didn't learn from anybody, but those objects are easier for me to sketch than people by far.
Same here. Well, great advice. Thank you.
It's surprising how little you need to make it happen too. Then they make special stubs and things for smearing and all of that. And then really good, I'm not a good sketch artist, but really good sketchers do that. And they're just superb. They're to me as enjoyable as photographs, if not better.
Your sketches look great to me. I found a middle ground for those sub things, a much less expensive middle ground was that when I make sketches, I like to take a paper towel out in the field with me, put it over the pencil eraser, and there's your smearing stub, right? With the paper
Oh,
surface.
yeah,
So
that is a great idea. That's
oh,
a really good
I love
idea.
it.
Mhm. The other thing you can do is there's a special paper. I can't think of vellum. It's a special paper. It's like a tracing paper that's super smooth, that is really, and you can really get a sense of nebulosity and show
Mhm.
fine variations. And lately, I haven't shown you any examples of those, but well, except the Crab Nebula, I take it back. The crab was made in Photoshop.
Mhm.
So I will use Photoshop tools to create those smoky looks of brighter and darker areas. And then you can make circles in Photoshop and place them,
Mhm.
diameter according to magnitude. So I have been doing that as well. I should mention it.
Good to know. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. So now going back to hardware questions for a moment. William Castro is curious if you use anything for coma correction with your Dobsonians.
I do not. I don't have a coma corrector. I'm my Dobsonian, my main instrument is a 15-inch f4.5. So, and then my 10-inch is an f6. So I
Mhm.
don't, if I was using an f4, I would definitely have a coma corrector, but I do not. I just put up with it.
Mhm.
I have some wide field eyepieces. Obviously, there's coma in them, but I'm not a purist when it comes to viewing through the scope, and so I just let that fall, and I enjoy sort of just the vastness of the field, you know, looking
Mhm.
out in the picture window effect. But yeah, if I was at f4, I'd get a coma corrector because that might compromise the aesthetic experience of observing more.
Mhm. Makes sense. Speaking of your 15-inch Dob, Scott Harrington was curious whether your observation of a magnitude 16.2 star while in the Duluth area was done using your 15-inch, or was that another scope?
No, that was definitely the 15-inch, and that's as low as
Right.
I've gone, Scott. I haven't I haven't tried lately to see if I can get any fainter with the 15-inch. I really need to recode it, to be honest with you. It's gotten some acid dew marks on it. But and it's in the Duluth area where I observe start. The faintest I can get is about I drive about 20 miles north of where I live here in Duluth. Sky is dark enough there. Aquarius is high enough for me so I can dig down into those low magnitudes. And I don't see it all the time either. It's just I check it to see, well, I wonder if I can see it tonight. And most of the time when I'm using averted vision and those other techniques, I can pull that 16.2 out when I'm magnifying it around 250x.
Mhm.
And if it wasn't for the AAVSO charts, you know, I wouldn't really know how faint I could get. But that
Right.
is a recent chart of VY Aquarii and that star that I've been using it for years. There are other
Mhm.
stars too.
Thank you. Another question from Scott Harrington. So Scott says he's well aware that you'll go outside for anything if it's clear and you're determined enough. But he's curious about your temperature tolerance for observing, living way up north as you do. Um, Scott mentions that he prefers to not go out when it's below like 35 degrees Fahrenheit, but I suppose you don't have that luxury.
I don't
So
have the luxury here, no, and I know a lot of amateurs, 32 is kind of the cutoff point, you know, in or out. Uh, it's such a lovely question, Scott. Thank you for asking that. Just to give you an example, okay, RS Ophiuchi, when it had one of the recurrent nova, it had an outburst. This is back sometime in the late 80s, I can't remember exactly when, late 80s, mid 80s. I had to see the outburst, and it was a January or early February morning, and it was 33 degrees below zero. I had the C11 out, so it must have been the mid 80s. And I did not turn the motor on because I thought it would just break at that temperature. But I did see RS Ophiuchi, and I made my estimate, and I was just so like triumphant, victorious that I achieved it. The coldest temperature I've been out in is 34 below here, where I had to see a certain comet. I remember it was
Mhm.
clear. I said, I got to do it. So I put myself out there in a sheltered, relatively sheltered place by trees. So there was no wind. And then I put in about an hour's worth of time, got back in the car, turned the heater all the way up, pulled my gloves off, put my hands on those heaters at full blast. You know how that is.
Oh, yes.
But the worst nights are below zero and windy. And if it's below zero and windy, I probably only go out for a bright supernova or, of course, T Corona Borealis.
Of course.
Of course.
Do you have any tips which you'd like to share for other people who are wanting to go out and observe T Corvor and other variables in the dead of winter?
Well, at this time of year, it's probably higher in the morning sky than it is in the evening. And it's certainly trending in that direction as we move through December into January. So tips as far as what instrument or
Uh, Apologies. I made that a little too specific, piggybacking off the T Corvor thing. I mean, tips for staying warm when you observe in the dead of winter,
oh,
whatever the target is.
oh, of course, yeah, staying warm. Yeah, I wear lined boots, kind of a wool lined or felt lined boot, long underwear, and then I've got this sort of a bib overall thing of an insulated bib overalls, and then a wool sweater, and then a big down coat and a bomber hat. And then I use kind of normal gloves, but what's been super helpful for me is the hot hands things, little chemical packets. So I put one in each glove, and that keeps my hands warm enough. But I know that I'm getting ready to go to electric gloves. So
Mm.
I think they've got some really good electric jackets and gloves. And I think those would be options worth looking into to stay warm. I do
Mhm.
find this about getting cold. There's the initial terror of, oh my God, it's freezing out. But there's a stasis point you reach of frozenness when you're out. You hit this sort of plateau where you can take it for maybe an hour, 45 minutes, and then things change after the plateau. So if you can get through the initial shock, stay at the plateau for half an hour, and then depart once you feel the trend becoming too extreme. But get to the plateau, and that's what I do all the time here with my wintertime observing. So, yeah. Also, there are variable stars that are out there. You memorize their fields, and so you can find them in 2 minutes. So even if you're out for 20 minutes, you could look at a number of variables and contribute that. And again, like I say, we're just so part of the process. These little contributions add up.
Absolutely. Well said. Next question here, changing topics a little bit. Ivan wants to know if you have any recommendations for atlases, especially if you are interested in deep sky observing.
Oh yeah, and I am a hardcore deep sky observer as well. I did the Messier catalog back when I was a teenager, and I'm working on trying to finally see ring galaxies and stuff right now, and they're quite challenging. And but yes, the atlas that I use, I've used Uranometria over the years. That has been my companion. But in the past few years, I've gone over to Interstellarum, which includes so much more, and it's for some reason easier to use for me. It's easier to read the way it's divvied up the pages, and I just really like that atlas. I should get the spelling here. Maybe I could look that up, but it's called Interstellarum, and it's available on Amazon. I know that you can get a field edition or you can get the regular in-house. So I have the field one has sort of plasticized pages, and then the desk edition is paper. But it is a dynamite atlas, really good. It's got everything in it.
Good to know. Thank you. Okay. Next question. So you mentioned that database of eclipsing binary ephemerides for if you want to observe things that are changing in real time, that you don't have to come back to night after night to see the changes. What is your favorite observation that you've ever done of an object like that, where you were able to see it
Oh,
changing?
and- oh, nice. Yeah, great. That's a good question. Um, the note or the variable, eclipsing variable that I saw happening kind of in real time was W Ursa Majoris. It's a very short period, and then I think it's X Trianguli. So
Right.
they have very, you have kind of the shoulder where there's a slow dip and then it goes straight down to a point and then it
Mhm.
goes straight back up. So in a matter of like an hour or two, you can, if you revisit the star, you can watch it change in its magnitude. So, and the AAVSO has charts for these objects too. So you'll be able to do some comparison. But of course, the key is finding out when's this going to happen. But I do
Mhm.
know that of the small number of these that I've observed, the rapid changers, the W Ursa Majoris is a good one.
Wonderful. All right, thanks. Um, okay, one other question. This one's coming from me actually. So I'm curious about your experience in seeing color in these targets. You mentioned some of them like the nova that you could see the red color in. That's fantastic. Have you ever seen color in a supernova, or are there other types of variable stars that you frequently can see color changes in?
Oh, wait, that's good. I've in terms of variable star, well, obviously the Miras, watching the color change there, from kind of a deeper red when they're closer to minimum or on their way to minimum versus sometimes when they're at maximum where it's a bit more dilute in color. Of course, novae show those color shifts. I wish I could see them turn bluish green when they're in the nebular phase, but of course they're much too faint, but hence the need for that O3 filter.
Mhm.
Supernovas. I have never seen any color in supernovas. No, they've always looked white to my eyes just because they don't reach that color threshold. So I do look for color in other objects like planetaries, and some other things, various other nebulae. But yeah, sad to say, there's not a ton of color in these variable stars, except the Miras. Again, and they do vary. The carbon star Miras, ooh, fantastic! You know how those are. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just worth it when you have a public star party. Always include a carbon star because it just makes everybody go, wow, they never knew a star could look so red as that. So I usually throw in, what's the one in Lyra, T Lyrae, or
Yeah.
the one down in Lepus, our Leprous.
Harley. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, those are wonderful. So yeah, we got to remember those too. Wonderful carbon stars.
Absolutely. Thank you. I see that Mike Foxen, who's here in the audience, also suggested a S Cephei for if you're looking for deep red color. So thanks for chipping that in, Mike.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Mike. And then I did notice when we were talking about star atlases that somebody mentioned the Sky Safari app as being a very useful. I use the same thing. I'm glad you brought that up because there are times when I'll just use the app at the telescope rather than
Mhm.
a star atlas because it's right there and I can kind of zoom in. And the app does go down to 15th magnitude or fainter. I mean, it includes everything in there. And it has the advantage of including comets and other transient type objects. So most helpful if you don't want to use a paper atlas. And Sky Safari is one of the best.
Do you observe when the moon is bright?
Some variables you can have no problem observing the moon. And here's the thing with the moon, when it's out, so I've observed the moon intensely as well over the years, looking for all of those different cracks and crannies, the rills, craterlets, and domes. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But when the moon is out, and especially now, the bright planets are out. You can look at Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter. So, yeah, if the moon's out, I'll often go out anyway, just to look at the planets if there are planets out. If it's a full moon and there are no planets, one of my very favorite things to do is just to go out, no matter the temperature, and just take a walk. I love walking around. I kind of live in the countryside. And I
Mhm.
like the quality of moonlight, the very dramatic contrast between shadows and light, the scary look of the tree shadows on a snowy road. Nothing better. So, and also it's fun with the moon to see at what phase can you perceive color with your eye. Now, when
Yes.
it's half or less, no. But I've for sure seen color, like my gloves or various objects, when the moon is full, once you're kind of dark adapted. So that's an interesting thing to do.
That is interesting. That is
Yeah.
interesting.
Hmm.
And uh, one follow-on question on that, and then we have a different topic, and then I think we'll be at the end of the question list. But speaking of moonlight's effect on your ability to see color, um, have you noticed any sort of a bias in your observations of red variables depending on, well, either their brightness or the brightness of the sky background behind them, like if there's a bright moon or not?
Yeah, I guess early on, I remember back in the early 80s, when I got my little handbook from the AAVSO, I think it was recommended not to observe red, particularly red variables, in bright moonlight or twilight, because the magnitudes might be biased because of that background lighting. And so I actually don't really observe Myra type stars when there's a bright moon out, but I might check on, some symbiotic variable or even some of the brighter CVs, uh, and certainly a nova, anything that's happening right now and won't last.
Right.
So the moon, you know, doesn't prevent me, but I'm wary of the moon when it comes to red stars.
Got it. That makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Hmm.
All right, I think this is our last question in the queue. So Robert McComber is curious, and it's okay to say, don't know, can't know. But Robert McComber is really curious for your take on T. corona borealis. Um, what have you been hearing about it? What's your feeling on making a prediction for this system?
Oh, yeah, I mean, we're all wondering, and of course we love our variable stars, and T Corona is doing one of the things that we love the most,
Oh yeah.
unfortunately or fortunately, and it's showing that it's a little unpredictable, and
Oh,
I can go with that. I mean, we try our best to forecast things as humans, and it's following its own path, I guess you could say. And I
mhm.
honestly, I have not heard any buzz about exactly what's happening, but I should really look into it because I've got people asking me, "Hey, whatever happened? Wasn't that star supposed to blow up?" And
Mhm.
and I just give them that answer. I say, "Well, we do our best, but it's going to do what it does when it does, and we should just be watching." So
Yep.
that's my answer. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone knows, but thank you for weighing in.
Oh, you bet.
That's been a sort of an obligatory question in all of our webinars recently for obvious reasons.
Yeah, it sounds like everybody's looking at it. I know when I go and look at the recent observations on the website, I
Mhm.
see hundreds of them every day. Obviously people are feeding in their VMAGs, whatever, and
Yes.
so it's what's happening there all the time. And that's why I ask my students to just once it comes back up in the sky, point the smartphone, photograph it. When it does blow, we may have a data point here. So
Mhm.
the whole citizen science movement, which has burgeoned in recent years, is something that people really appreciate. I know if somebody makes a contribution, however small, they really feel proud of themselves, makes them happy. So I try to encourage that in small, in ways that are easy for people, whether it's T Corona or Betelgeuse or Delta Scorpii and so on, stars that are easily visible and variable.
Mhm. Wonderfully put. Thank you. Okay, it looks like we are at the end of our questions, so I'm going to go ahead and put up our outro slides here. And my first and most important announcement to make is not so much an announcement as just a heartfelt thank you to Bob. Bob, this has been an outstanding webinar session. Thank you so much for your excellent
Oh,
presentation and
thank you.
insightful Q&A.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It was really, it truly is an honor. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for coming. Let's see. Oh, yes. I would also like to thank again this webinar sponsor, Voice Astro. They've sponsored our entire 2024 series for this past year. We're incredibly grateful for their support. The Voice Research Initiative and Education Foundation provides online astronomy education, observatory resources, and research experiences to students, student teams, and schools in order to learn how to perform observations, conduct research, and publish their results in scientific journals, such as the Journal of the AAVSO. Please check out their webpage to learn more about this very important work. Also, as a reminder, the 2025 annual campaign has begun. This is our major fundraising campaign for the year. It is our time to bug you for donations and say that every dollar that has been donated so far, which we've received over $36,000 in donations for the annual campaign so far, is going to be stretched, and it'll go a long way towards variable star education, towards making a difference in the world of citizen science. And so to everyone who has already contributed a donation, we'd just like to give a heartfelt thank you for your support. You're really allowing us to accomplish our mission. To anyone who is currently considering making a donation, there is really no better time than today. If you'd like to learn more about what your donation will be used for, you can scan the QR code, which is on the screen, or you can visit aavso.org/donate now. We have some details on that page for transparency about exactly what donations end up accomplishing. So I hope that you will check that out and consider making a donation to support our work. And I would also like to mention that next year's webinar series is scheduled to kick off on January 11th. The full schedule will be published pretty soon on aavso.org/webinars. Our first webinar of the year on January 11th is going to be pretty different from the usual format. It's going to be more interactive, even perhaps more interactive than this session was. We had a great Q&A here, but we're trying things a little bit differently. So I don't want to give it all away immediately, because we're still hammering out the last detail. But once that's sorted, you can expect to see an email in your inbox, probably at the beginning of the year, with a registration link inside. And I hope that you will mark your calendars and show up, because this should be a fun experiment. So we're looking forward to it. Okay, and last but not least, I would like to thank everyone who has joined in during today's webinar. All of you out there in the audience who watched, listened, and asked very insightful questions, it is your participation in all of our webinars and all of our programs which allows us to keep growing, keep educating, and keep making an impact on variable star science. So, thank you. We're so grateful for your support. This webinar has been recorded. You can find the recording on our Facebook page, where it will be automatically uploaded just as soon as we close down the session here today. It will also be uploaded very soon to our YouTube channel, which you can find by going to YouTube and searching for our username, AAVSOHQ. It will be joining a large library of past webinars. We've been running this series for many years. We've got, I think, well over 100 webinars now uploaded on YouTube, covering topics from the nitty-gritty technical of photometry and spectroscopy to past webinars with a visual observing focus, and even more kind of out there scientific experiments being covered in lectures. So it's a great educational resource, and I hope that you will check it out and enjoy some of our past recordings over the winter break. Okay, now to close out, I would like to express one last huge thank you to Bob King from all of us here at the AAVSO. This was an outstanding session, and we really appreciate you and your willingness to volunteer to share this information with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, see you all in the new year.